And we've been working on a series on the Sermon on the Mount, and we're still there today, looking at Matthew 5. Of course, it's where the Sermon on the Mount's at, and it's looking at verses 23 through 33 today. And Jesus had left a list of things in there. I guess I should follow my notes or I'll really get myself messed up. This is the passage where Jesus was talking about sexual sin and the desires that lead up to it. And also I was covering Jesus' view on divorce. The Sermon on the Mount is where Jesus teaches his followers about life in God's kingdom. Now, it doesn't amaze me that men and women get involved in sexual sin. What amazes me is how much they're willing to pay for it. Long-standing relationships of love and trust are shattered. Kids lose their parents and are scattered by sorrow, scattered by sorrow and guilt. People surrender their careers, their reputations, their homes, their savings, their friends, their relationship with God, all in a pursuit of happiness, or they think happiness, that vanishes with an ever-diminishing half-life. So what would make somebody want to do that? Risk so much to gain so little? There's three things. There's lots of things, but I've noted three here. First, you usually don't realize how much sexual sin is going to cost. It rarely comes with a visible price tag attached. The cost is hidden. And besides that, it's pleasure purchased on credit, with unmentioned payments due for the rest of your life. And second, sex is a very powerful force. It compels people to voluntarily do things they'd never think themselves capable of doing under normal circumstances. And combined with sexual and emotional attraction is an undertow that captures people who are merely waiting by the beach, sweeps them out to sea, and does everything possible to drown them. And sex is powerful, but also deceptive, because those who are being swept out to sea are willing and excited about going on this adventure into deep waters. And the third thing, sexual sin doesn't begin with glaring and blatant transgressions. It starts with something very small and innocent, something that looks so harmless, it's easy to allow. It starts with desire. Now, this particular section, talking about the kingdom code, or Jesus' code for living in his kingdom, is the rules that we need to follow for citizenship. So we don't follow the rules to get into the kingdom. The only way to get into it is by trusting in Jesus and what he's done for us. So the reason we follow the rules is because we're already in the kingdom. Since we trust God to tell us the truth, and when he says something is off limits, we believe that he's got our best interest at heart, and that he's trying to spare us from the pain and destruction that sin would produce if we were given the chance. But as Jesus lays this out, it becomes obvious that he's explaining not just the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law's intent. So Jesus says it's not enough to avoid certain external sinful behaviors. We also need to honor God with our thoughts, our motives, and our attitudes. The inner things only God can know about us. So Matthew 5 contains 6 comparisons between this external performance and the internal obedience that God desires. Jesus talks about anger, lust, divorce, lying, revenge, and hatred. In each case, he calls us, his followers, to commit ourselves not just to obey the external requirements of the law, but also to allow his code to govern our thoughts, our motives, and our attitudes. Last week we talked about anger, and it's not just an external behavior of murder that's wrong. It's also wrong to maintain unresolved anger toward another person. So today we're going to talk about a couple of more of the 6 contrasts. First, we look at what Jesus teaches us about lust. In God's kingdom, it's not only against the law to cheat on your spouse, it's also against the law just to entertain the desire to have an affair with someone else. Now, Matthew 5, verse 27 says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old, Thou shalt not commit adultery." And all through this section, Jesus breaks it down that way. He says, "You have heard," and quotes the law. And then he says, "But then I tell you," and he gives the concept on it. So the Old Testament law was clear. Adultery was wrong. Sleeping with someone else's spouse, but it could refer to a broader spectrum of sexual sins. And then Jesus goes on in verse 28, he says, "But I say unto you, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." So Jesus says adultery is not the only thing to avoid. Adultery is the external behavior. But Jesus looks at the internal thoughts and motives. So the key word in the sentence is lustfully. However, it's actually not a very good translation of the Greek word. The English word lust carries a decidedly negative and sexual connotation, both of which are missing in the Greek word. I won't try to pronounce it. It simply means to desire something or to long for something, and it's strictly a neutral term. In other words, whether desire is good or bad depends entirely on what we're desiring. The Bible uses the same word to say that one who wants to be an elder desires a noble task. Paul, when he was looking at going on, actually, I think it was when he was going to be going to Rome, he desired to depart. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong reference. Paul said he desired to depart this life to be with Christ. And in one of the accounts at the Last Supper, Jesus eagerly desired to eat the Last Supper with his disciples. And the prophets in the Old Testament longed to see the Messiah, and angels longed to understand our salvation. And that uses the same word on all of those. So when Jesus uses the word, it's usually positive. But here it's obvious that he's talking about a desire for a woman that God has placed off limits. So Jesus says to desire that woman is wrong, just as adultery itself is wrong. And there's a few things that can be misunderstood about that verse. So I'll take a moment and say a little bit of what the verse does not say. First, it doesn't mean that that desire is adultery, or that desire is just as bad as adultery. As soon as you've desired that you've already committed adultery, so having the thought is not the same as the action. We notice that it doesn't say you've already had adultery with her, but you've had adultery with her in your heart. So desire for an inappropriate sexual relationship is emotional adultery, not physical adultery. What this is saying is that it's not only wrong to consummate an off-limits relationship, it's also wrong to desire an off-limits relationship. Both are wrong, but not the same. Now, secondly, this verse doesn't mean that sexual desire itself is wrong. God created it, and he created us with a strong sexual desire. He also gave us the perfect context to indulge these desires, and that's the marriage relationship. So sex was God's invention. He came up with it. He made it attractive and pleasurable, and he wants his followers to enjoy it. So he designed marriage as the perfect context for it. But to use God's gift outside the context of marriage is to violate the operating instructions in the owner's manual. Sex wasn't designed to work outside marriage. It won't work outside marriage. So instead of bringing the fulfillment that God created it to produce, it'll bring us temporary pleasure and then long-term destruction and heartache. And I thought Proverbs 6 said it pretty eloquently. It says in verses 25 through 29, it says, "Lust not after her beauty in thine heart, neither let her take thee with her eyes. For by means of wasn't the scripture I was thinking of, but that's all right. It fits. For by means of the whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread. An adulteress will hurt for the precious, or will hunt for the precious life. Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals and his feet not be burned? So he that goeth into his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her, shall not be innocent. But whoso committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding. He that doth it destroyeth his own soul. I don't know, a lot of you are probably like me, you tend to put things together and then read the instructions. So, here's the glue, we'll just glue it all together. And, and then you stop and read the instructions where it says, warning, don't put glue on part C until you've first connected parts A and B. But by that time, it's too late, it's ruined, and it'll never work the way it's supposed to. That's what happens when we use sex outside of the context of marriage. It messes things up, and it destroys. And that's why God says it's off limits. He loves us and wants us to have the best. He doesn't want us assembly. He didn't send us assembly instructions to keep us from having fun. He sent them so that we could get the maximum enjoyment out of his gifts. And third, I believe that this verse is not saying that merely to have these desires is wrong. I believe that to entertain or nurture the desire for an inappropriate relationship is wrong. We can remember last week when we were talking about anger. Anger isn't wrong. It's wrong to leave it unresolved. And in the same way, I believe it isn't sin to be attracted to someone. However, to hang on to that desire, to feed it, or to act upon it, that's what's wrong. Like anger, desire is initially a response, not a choice. Now, we probably have inappropriate desires as often as we do because we're fallen. So in that aspect of it, desire would be sinful. But it's not a sin in the sense of a choice that we make to disobey God. When it first strikes, I think desire is more of a temptation to sin. It's what we choose to do with desire and what we choose to do because of desire that makes it sinful. It's unrestrained desire that's sinful. That's the point that Jesus is trying to make in this verse. It's not only the external behavior of adultery that's wrong, it's also wrong to harbor and nourish a secret internal desire for an illicit relationship. Physical adultery is wrong, but so is emotional adultery, or mental adultery, or attitudinal adultery. So, this is why purity is so important. Not only purity in actions, but also purity in thoughts. Because Jesus goes on in verses 29 and 30 to explain just how important it is. Verse 29 says, and if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And then he parallels that with verse 30. It says, and if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. Now, these verses aren't suggesting that we should fight sexual sin by literally plucking our eye out or cutting our hand off. I'm pretty confident that if we really tried, we could, even if we only had a left eye and a left hand, we could still figure out how to sin in a sexual relationship. So when these two verses, or what these two verses are saying, is that sexual purity is both action and thought, is very important. It's so important that it's worth sacrificing something otherwise, or sacrificing some otherwise good things, if they might lead us into sin. Colossians chapter 3, verses 4 and 5 say, when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory. Mortify therefore your members, which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanliness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, can't say that word, and covetousness, which is idolatry. And I looked it up and I don't remember the meaning of it again. So, but like the Titanic, we're off course and getting ready to run into that iceberg. So some practical advice about dealing with sexual desire, and some of them aren't explicitly from the Bible, but are some practical things I've learned about trying not to let desire turn into sin. Desire is an alarm. It's like a proximity alarm. Action needs to be taken to avoid a collision. So we need to recognize first that we're vulnerable. We have to watch our input. We need to dress thoughtfully, watch our circumstances, think about the consequences, and tell someone else. Have accountability to somebody else. And then we need to run away from it, and we need to rely on God's Spirit. And here's the verses in Proverbs I was thinking of that I thought laid it out pretty eloquently. It says, drink waters out of your own cistern. Sorry, this is Proverbs 5, 15 through 20. It says, drink water out of your own cistern, and running water out of thine own well. Let thy foundations be dispersed abroad, and rivers of water in the streets. Let them be only thine alone, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as a loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished also with her love. And why would thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? Now, moving on to the next part of what Jesus was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount is addressing his thoughts on divorce. And as divorce becomes more and more prevalent, there's a greater acceptance of it. In fact, for children growing up today, it's become uncommon to live with both your mom and your dad. But despite its popularity, divorce is incredibly destructive and hurtful. There have been numerous studies of the detrimental effect of divorce on a child and on their sense of stability, confidence, and self-value. Divorce not only brings about profound personal emotional pain from rejection, but it often also leads to deep-seated anger, resentment, bitterness, and sometimes even violence. So in this part, we're looking at Matthew 5, 31 and 32, and a related passage in Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus talks about his own views of divorce. Just as he did with the previous subjects, Jesus begins with what his followers already know about divorce from the Old Testament, and that was that God permitted it. Matthew 5, 31 and 32 say, verse 31, it hath been said, whoso shall put away his wife, let him give her a writ of divorcement. And that's taken from Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, which says, and when a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it came to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanliness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorce, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. after that she is defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. Now, again, Jesus goes on with the you've heard, or this is what the law says, but I'm giving you this new idea. In verse 32, it says, But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, save for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. So the law looks at the external, which is divorce, and God looks at the internal, which is a motive and our commitment. So God's design for marriage in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9, says, The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are not more no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. So God's looking at the lifelong commitment and faithfulness, and it working out our differences. But at the same time, when things don't work out, Matthew 19, verse 7 says, Then they say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writ of divorce and put her away? And Jesus, or he saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wife. But from the beginning it was not so. And then in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11, Paul goes on, and it says, And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So if there is no sexual sin, but you just can't stand to be married anymore, the Bible does permit for a divorce. But in that event, you should remain unmarried. And you might ask why on that. And it's because God is able to put any marriage back together again. To remarry is to close the door on reconciliation, and in God's eyes is adultery or unfaithfulness to the covenant that you've made. And next week or next time, or in the Sermon on the Mount, we'll get into more on that covenant or on covenants that you make. But if your ex remarries or has a sexual relationship, then that bond is broken and you're free to remarry. Now in Matthew 19, going on with verse 9 here, it says, And I say unto you, whoso shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And who marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. And then Mark chapter 10, verse 12, saying, If a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 through 15, and this is Paul talking again, going on from where we were before, it says, But to the rest I speak, not the Lord. So he's stressing that this is his opinion, not what God told him. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such a case, but God hath called us to peace. So, a little bit harder part of the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus told it to us for reasons. So I'd like to close today with some practical advice about recovering from a divorce. If you've been divorced, it's important to accept God's forgiveness. Even if you're not the one that was, or even if you were the one in the wrong. And if you've been through a divorce, you need to forgive your ex and the other people involved in the situation. Because holding that resentment in our hearts only hurts us. If you've been divorced in the past, God will forgive. He forgives us regardless of who was at fault. And He can move on and people can remarry. Now, some of the churches won't let people minister, but God forgives, even if men don't. And my dad used to joke about it, and I probably don't have it worded exactly right, but because at the time, the assemblies was very strict about it, that if you were divorced, you could not be a minister. They've since changed that rule, but so he used to joke about it and say, if I kill somebody, the church will let me keep my license, but if I get divorced, they won't. So watch out, Carol.